Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and welcome to this Mythic Plus Week Analyzed. This week's affixes are Fortified, Sanguine, Grievous, and of course Awakened. So in this series, we're going to take a look at which dungeons are good each week, whether or not the week as a whole is good, and for what sorts of players it's going to be an easier or harder week to play Mythic Plus, which classes and specs have a particularly easy or hard time this week, and what you can do potentially as a specific spec or potentially just in general to make this week a little bit easier going into it. So let's get started off by talking about whether or not this is a good week. So in terms of the affixes that we've got going on here, this is actually one that I would say is one of the better ones overall here, this week 12. It's not as good as weeks number 6 or 4 for really high-end pushing teams, but I think it might be one of the best aside from those. There are some Bullstring fortified weeks that are... Bullstring is actually a pretty good affix in some dungeons for pushing. But other than that, Sanguine and Grievous, for the very high-end teams, these are affixes that I would say are difficult, but not slow. They don't slow down the dungeon if you play around them well. They just make things a little bit more complicated. Contrast that with, for example, the week that we just left, which was Raging Explosive Tyrannical, where for the most part, those affixes, rather than being difficult, explosive does have some difficulty to it, but the more important effect of those affixes was that they constrained how big you could pull at a time. Week 12 here, this week that we're moving into, doesn't really have any of those constraints on how big you can pull. It more just says, look, it's gonna be 33 minutes of tight technical execution in this dungeon, and if you can do all of that without making any mistakes, you can potentially time this key at a very high level. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some teams pushing score this week. However, there are some specific reasons why you may not see that this week. Some of the world's top teams, that's a pretty small community, are not playing this week for various real-life reasons, or for the MDI, which we've got the MDI Global Finals approaching, which means that many of the top teams, even if they only included 1 or 2 players who are competing in that, are probably going to be out of commission for this and the next couple weeks while they're gearing up for that, now that they have tournament realm access and everything. So that's one effect that I think is going to mean that we're probably not going to see teams breaking past the 6,200 mark that was set in week number 10. But it would still be, it's definitely still possible if there's a team that actually has that level of skill and can play together for all 7 days this week. I think that there are keystones that can be done better than ever before this week, because of course our corruption level is still advancing and everybody now has like fully socketed, fully BIS gear in those top teams. So that's the situation for top teams. Mid-level key pushing, if you're somebody who's pushing 3K, 2K, 1800, whatever on Raider.io, whatever your goals are there, this week is probably an average week, depending on where the strength is in your group. This is a week that can be very carried by, especially somebody like a Resto Druid. If you have a really all-star, if you are or have a really all-star Resto Druid in your group, for instance, they can handle both Sanguine and Grievous pretty much with Typhoon and their healing. And so a lot of power lies in people that can handle those affixes entirely by themselves. However, if you're playing with random pug players, if you're playing a spec that doesn't bring tools to help control Sanguine, if you're just a DPS player and the best you can do is try and kill mobs at the right time, try and DPS things evenly, but you're not the tank who can move the mobs or somebody with a displacement effect, then this is a week where you're largely going to be at the mercy of the skill of the players who can do those things in your group, and that might make it a pretty frustrating week. Let's talk about what some of those specs are that do have good effects this week. So just mentioning Resto Druid. Resto Druid plays extremely well against Grievous and Sanguine, as I was saying. Every tank in the game also has a huge amount of agency this week. I wouldn't say that there's any particularly good or bad tanks this week. Brewmaster's a little bit of an interesting case. Brewmaster is historically one of the toughest tanks to play on Grievous weeks, although now that they're getting to huge amounts of versatility, that kind of stops mattering as the Grievous ends up being outclassed by all of that verse. But they do have the big benefit of being a tank with a huge displacement effect with Ring of Peace. So monks in general with Ring of Peace, very valuable this week. Other than that, you're really looking for, against Grievous, any kind of tanky DPS players, any DPS players with self-healing, off-healing as well, very valuable this week. And generally, people that don't stand in things. Grievous and Sanguine together have a little bit of an interesting interaction where if you have somebody who just steps inside a Sanguine puddle for a sec, that can actually be really costly, especially if your healer is somebody that doesn't handle Grievous all that well. So these are specs like the Priest healers, Resto Shaman end up having usually a tougher time with Grievous than the other specs do, just due to the nature of how their kits work. So that can be something to watch out for. And then beyond that, you're looking for DPS players that can ideally kill everything at the same time, or not stun things or slow things inside the Sanguine puddles. So this is a week where stuff like incidental stuns from Outlaw Rogues or Frost Mage slows, all of those kind of effects that are normally positive, they can be negative. It's not necessarily always bad, but you need to be playing with competent players, especially if there's somebody like an Outlaw Rogue. You just see that 6 second between the eyes stun show up on something while it's inside those Sanguine puddles. That's going to be a really costly thing to have happen to your group. Okay, let's talk a little bit about which dungeons are good and bad this week. You see I've got the Motherlode open here in my Method Dungeon tools. This is one that I would describe as a pretty bad one this week. Sanguine in general in here is really rough. Sanguine, most on-death affixes in this dungeon, I guess both Sanguine and Bolstering are tough, but Sanguine in particular, these mechanized peacekeepers represent the best way to get count in this dungeon, and they have this annoying habit of cast sequencing, like 5 abilities for 10 seconds, standing still, and if that happens to be inside a puddle, then you can full heal one of these things, and they have a lot of health. So Motherlode ends up being a pretty rough Sanguine dungeon. Siege of Borealis also... So Siege of Borealis is an interesting one, because on bolstering weeks, it's actually fairly good for very high key pushing, because you can bolster up a spotter and use it to kill the whole dungeon. This week, you don't really get that benefit. The only benefit you get is that you can heal the spotter if you choose to with Sanguine puddles, and maybe groups are going to do that, but for the most part, I think that Siege with Sanguine in particular, this is one of the roughest affix combos for this dungeon, so I would stay away from this one. I stay away from Siege pretty much every week. There's pretty much always a reason in the affixes to stay away from Siege, so I'm pretty much never in this stupid dungeon, except for when all of our keys turn into it. Let's see. Other than that, I think that for the most part, dungeons are about where you would expect them to be, about where they are in a normal week. Tol Dagor is an example of a dungeon that is heavily technical with Sanguine placement really mattering here. So this floor, for instance, when you're in Jess Howless's area, it's very narrow spaces. All of these enemies flee when they're low on health. It can be very painful with Sanguine active, or it can be a non-affix if you are playing with a group of players that has it under control. If you have access to those crowd controlling effects, Vengeance, Demon Hunter, Sigils, and be careful with Ring of Peace and Typhoon in here. If you Ring of Peace or Typhoon, if you use a traditional knock effect on these things, they can fall through the floor, so do be careful of that. Although sometimes, the other option is for them to bathe in Sanguine for a while, so you got to take that risk. Shout out goes to Freehold this week, where Freehold has Fortified active, which is good news. Eudora's on our side, which is great news. And it's because Eudora's on our side, that means the event to join the crew is the easiest one, where you just talk to the bartender person. So you don't have to do the dog or the extra, Blacktooth brawler mobs here. So a great week for Freehold. This is also a dungeon that's fairly wide open, so Sanguine tends to not be bad in here either. Although you do have to be careful to not drop Sanguine where Eudora's going to jump. I've seen that. I've seen that cause problems for groups before, so do be careful about that when you're about to engage this boss. And yeah, beyond that, most dungeons are about in their usual place. I would say Shrine of the Storm. This is Shrine of the Storm really quick. This is a dungeon where people think of this as being a really bad dungeon on death affix weeks. So the on death affixes are Bolstering, Sanguine, and Bursting. And it is pretty difficult on Bolstering and Bursting weeks because of all these little mobs. I would actually say that on Sanguine week, it's not that bad at all. You just drop these puddles pretty quickly. It doesn't really matter if they overlap because they have so little health that it's not gonna cause like a huge problem if one of these things just heals for half of its health bar. That doesn't really do anything. And you have enough space in this dungeon that you can kind of move away from wherever you drop the Sanguine. So I would say this is a dungeon that probably looks worse than it is this Sanguine week. So I wouldn't be too worried about that one. Beyond that, I think most dungeons are about where you'd expect this week. All right. One final note before I let you guys go is corruption this week. This week is a week where, because Grievous is active, I would advise you to play a slightly more defensive corruption setup than you're normally used to. If you have the option of dropping from, say, 59 to 39 corruption, I think it's going to be worthwhile this week. And here's why. Getting corruption ticks on you, getting corruption effects on you is going to put you into Grievous, and that is something that you should be careful of, and you want to have that happen less often, ideally. That'll save you a lot of damage, right? But also, because you are taking Grievous damage ticks throughout the dungeon, and because those are all, new damage instances, each of them can spawn things from beyond or Eye of Corruption. Well, things from beyond for you, if you're above 40 corruption. Eye of Corruption, of course, spawns on your effects, not on damage taken. But thing from beyond spawns when you take damage. So on Grievous weeks, you're going to get far more things from beyond than you would on weeks where none of the affixes directly damage you. So because of that, I would say try and stay away from Thing from Beyond if you can avoid it. If it's not too much of a damage loss to go below Thing from Beyond spawning, then that's something that's worth doing. And just keeping your Eye of Corruption at a smaller radius as well. It's often a lot easier to get outside of a 39 radius Eye of Corruption than a 59 one. So I think that this is a week where if it's close, try and drop out of Thing from Beyond range. And it's not even that bad to drop to a smaller Eye of Corruption or even no Eye of Corruption. If you have bad corruption and you're just putting on 20 corruption of Void Ritual or whatever to finish out your set, just don't bother. Just play the low corruption. And you kind of get a DPS benefit of not having to move for your Eye of Corruption and not, having to use your defensives against things from beyond. So there is a little bit of a hidden DPS increase as a result of playing less corruption, especially on weeks like this where it can be potentially very dangerous. All right. Also, you can get the corruption slow procking on you from you're trying to just beeline through a sanguine puddle, and then the corruption slow procs on you, and you're spending 6 extra years bathing in the sanguine, dying very quickly as a result of that. So yeah, you gotta be careful of those things. Anyways, I think that is about the end of my knowledge for this week. If I come up with anything else, I'll try and put it in the comments or description or whatever. If you come up with anything else, put it in the comments as well, and upvote the good ones and stuff. Remember to check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.